Today's episode, we are going to, let's say, revisit and also visit a, a line of thinking that has really been working its way through my mind recently, and that is the notion that a country needs to create a myth behind itself in order to give a story to its people, to its citizens, and what that does on a broader scale, and especially over a long period of time. And could not be a better time, I think, to do this show with the most recent interview of one of my favorite podcast hosts and historian, I guess now. I don't even know. His name is Martyr Made. You can go check him out. I've definitely referenced him a few times. Anyway, big viral interview. Things got a little bit controversial, and I want to talk about it today. So, without any further ado, let's get right into it. So, today's show, it's an interesting one. Myth, fact, what turns into a mythology, what turns into a hero story, and what turns into a villain story, evil. Are things as simple as good and evil? All these things we're going to touch on today. Again, couldn't thank you guys for tuning in enough. I had a few, I would say, really good shows recently. I've gotten good feedback from you guys, so all I could say is keep it up. Keep hitting up the likes, hit up the comments. Something that you don't like, let us know. Something that you like, please let us know. What I think and what other people have told me is going well. Well, I just can't wait for more people to hear it. So share it out to your friends. Let us know, like it up, get us in that algorithm. Without any further ado, let's get into it. So Martyr Made. Martyr Made is a podcast, just so we could start off with a little bit of frame of reference here. Martyr Made is a podcast that has been focusing on very singular events in history, profound ones, but very singular events and not extremely broad in its scope. And I think that the next series to come out is going to be quite broad in scope, especially compared to what has been talked about. And that's going to be the frame of mind of what it is to look at World War II through a German perspective. And I couldn't be more excited. I want to hear what he's got to say. But as he came out and he got interviewed by Tucker Carlson, we have talked about Tucker's interviews in the past. They're definitely not what his show used to be, but they are interesting, I would say, and his guests that he's able to pull on are very interesting. So with this, what Darryl said, and we'll talk a little bit more about World War II later, but the thing that got him in trouble, I guess you could say, or the thing that people are trying to use the social media guillotine, so to speak, on him for is that he came out to say that he believed that the chief villain of World War II was Winston Churchill, not Adolf Hitler, not Joseph Stalin. And for this he's being crucified, essentially. And I guess what I want to talk about today is it right to do that? Is it right to bring up the points that he was making? And we'll get to him again later on, but what it means for us as a people to create this storyline, this narrative that fits so perfectly for our way of thinking or for the way that we go about life and for the way that we talk to our friends, family, or people that we're trying to make an impart on. It's very important to understand where we may be letting our biases get in front. And so it's kind of what I want to talk about with you guys today. And I'm going to start off with one of my most touching, I would say, and most impactful on my life events in history, and something that has been turned into a Disneyfication, I would say, without much push needed, without much of a control needed from the government. And that is the American backstory and how America came to be, right? And just starting with this example, what it takes to be truthful about the onset of America, about our whole creation story, and every little facet that goes into how America became America today. You would be mistaken to leave out the dark parts of our history. And, to point to our founding fathers and certain figures that helped to broaden the scope of the American movement, especially in the early days, and the amount of, I would say, hypocritical positions that they held given the document that they ended up signing. It makes you wonder, right? And it also, I think another good question to ask is, would it be right, especially for our education system, like maybe not holding our government accountable and making them reduce the press to softballers, right? That's beside the point. People can write what they want, thankfully, in this country, which is fantastic. That's why I love living here. It's why I love doing the show with you guys based in the United States. If I was to do this show anywhere else in the world, I could be in some major trouble, right? I've already gotten in trouble with the social media gods a couple of times now, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, but I don't know if this show would exist if I was from another country. So for that, I'm very thankful. And for that, I think you can point to what a good idea America was to allow things like this. Even if you don't like what I have to say, or even if I don't like what you have to say, you have the right to say it. And that, I think that could be in of itself just a value that it, especially worldwide, was not the case anywhere. Now, to talk about some of the failures in the United States, I think is just as important, right? And of course, nowadays you see, as if you were brought up in the school system around a similar time from myself, or let's say even within the last 20 years, and you come through the American way of teaching, you are going to learn a lot about slavery, about the westward expansion, the manifest destiny. And for that, you wonder, for America to tell its story, is it necessary for them to divulge into these topics, right? So you're going to talk about, figures that pop into my head would be like a Jefferson of Washington. Those who were a part of, Washington might not have had his hands on the document creating our Constitution, but he did endorse it, right? And he fought for these values, so to speak. And to say that you're fighting for life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, but you have to be a white man. And nobody ever said that part out loud, but that's the caveat there, especially in the beginning. If you weren't a white man, or possibly maybe even not even a landowning white man, you don't enjoy the same privileges that the rest of the people do under this document. And so that hypocritical view of writing something down and having something codified into law, but not actually abiding by it or not even believing it per se, I think it is important to be able to point that out in just regular media nowadays, and any sort of platform that you can get it on. I think it is very important. Why do I think it's important? Well, it kind of goes back to that myth thing that I brought up before, the mythology, the storytelling of a nation, that up and coming story. You have to give your country some meaning, and in maintaining that meaning, you are inevitably going to cut out some of the bad. I think that is, even if you're, say, not happy with the way that story is told, it's at least understandable, right? But cutting out such a, when you first hear about, I look back on the way that our teaching was transformed as I got older, right? So the way that they taught the American colonies when I was in third grade or fourth grade or whatever the first time they introduced it is very different to the time when you're going to be introduced in middle school, which is again going to be very different from the time you're introduced back in high school when you have an actual U.S. history. And the dumbification, the stupefying of a very immense topic like the 13 colonies, what it took to create each colony, how each colony was different in its outlook on its acceptances, what religions it allowed in, creeds it allowed in, did it allow slavery, all of these different things. And to make it into a topic as simple as, well, some pilgrims came on a couple of boats and they set up a Thanksgiving, which is, as I remember it, that is the original teaching of how America was created. I think it serves a purpose there, right? I guess. And I'm going to say that big I guess and a big asterisk next to that, because I think to believe, and just being honest here, just to believe that kids can't understand complex topics, maybe we have to work harder for them to see a point of view, but to think that kids can't understand complex topics, or they can't be humorous, they can't be given sadness through a story, I think it's incomprehensible. And to not teach them the reality and to just teach them a lie, basically, I think is foolish, in my opinion. It's very foolish. And when you're talking about specifically the American creation story, how much we had to fight as Americans. I said we, I wasn't even here yet. My family wasn't here yet. But how much those original founders had to fight. Okay, what they had to put by the wayside in order to get their way, what they had to do that was probably against their morals, but at the end of the day was for the cause, for the country. If you're not to talk about those things, if you're not to speak to those as a moral failing, just like you might say it was a moral failing for the British to try to maintain power over us with the sea in between us, if you're not going to admit the failures on that side, on your own side, I think that the problem that you run into, which is a problem that we see, I think, as a continuation, and especially as we move on to the other topics I want to talk about today, you're going to see you start building up a lot of lies. And the way that lying works, at least my understanding of it is, it's kind of like a pathogen, if you will. It's like something that once you start, it spreads and it spreads and it spreads and it starts affecting parts of your life that you didn't even expect it to start affecting. So when I was a kid, I really had no problem making up whatever would put me into the best position to succeed. So whatever words had to come out of my mouth, I was decently prepared to utilize language in order to position me ahead. And slowly over time, and especially when I started to come back to religion, come back to a faith that grounded me in truth, honesty, love, it was only then, I would say, and as I started coming into adulthood, that speaking the truth and not just saying things that would be provocative because I knew they might get attention, I stopped doing that. And, even with this podcast, some of the more outrageous things that I've tried to say, if you call them outrageous, I've done so from a position of trying to espouse the fact, not trying to be controversial. Okay, I don't think it's controversial to say, take a stance on abortion that you hold morally. I don't think it's wrong, or I don't think it's controversial to take a stance on guns, on transgenderism, on XYZ topic. I don't think picking a position there when you're coming from a position of trying to seek the truth, I don't think you're purposely being controversial there. And I don't think that there's as much of a problem as what I used to do again as a kid, where I would, when I knew something would rile up a teacher or rile up a class, I would have no problem saying something that got me in trouble, and it did multiple times. And nowadays, I would say that I've grown out of that, but only in, again, a way of finding myself through not only faith, but adulthood, and realizing where truth can put me compared to where lying can. And again, one of the biggest reasons that I stopped trying to make excuses and lie was that it starts affecting more and more of your life, and the logic of using a lie comes into every single part. When it seems more convenient to lie, why wouldn't you? And just get yourself completely out of trouble. And I think if you take that as a broader lens and you take a step back and you use that on a countrywide scope and telling a story, and how do you tell the next generation of how we came to exist, well, you're going to start coming up with problems here where you're telling the American creation story and completely throwing to the wayside slavery, throwing to the wayside the manifest destiny and all negative aspects that came along with that, whether that be led marches or relocation or just flat out killing. If you're going to take those parts out of your creation, I think you're underselling what it means to create something that is the United States, something that is so vast, so great. Nowadays, it took a lot. It took a lot of grit. It took a lot of fight. And to me, I think speaking to, this is my opinion here, but speaking to the negative aspects that brought it about, actually go to strengthen the good parts. I think if you were to be honest with them and not try to hide them in the corner so much. And with that, the creation story of the United States, that kind of leads me right into the next topic that I wanted to talk about, which is World War II. It's exactly what Darryl Cooper at Martyr Made was speaking about when he got really, the online version of guillotined, I would say, or if they're attempting to anyway. Crucified might be better. Either way, what I think Darryl is trying to do in saying what he said, when he said, and I believe this is a quote, so I don't think I'm misquoting him either, by saying that Churchill was the most evil of all the leaders. What he's trying to say, and part of the problem here is that people are taking him out of context, of course, but what he's trying to say is that Churchill's decisions and Churchill's way of thinking, and people like Churchill, so not even just Churchill himself, but people who may have been in the pocket of Churchill, people who may have been guiding Churchill, maybe from foreign places like the United States, their decision-making led the war to what it was. It was not going to be, this is perspective here, it was not going to be the all-out world war that it became unless it had been for Churchill, unless it had been for his manipulation of the English language, propaganda. And for us to take a step back and understand what he's trying to say, I think it's extremely important as well to understand that each side in World War II comes from a place that was set up by World War One, and of course by preceding events in history as well. Talk about the American Civil War, which was a big wake up call to the rest of the world on what the killing power of some of the machines that we were creating as human beings, and what that power could be and what it could display as. And a lot of people took that. They took the early Japanese and Russia war as another sign. But those leading preceding events, and of course, many of the European leaders were basing a lot of their defense strategies and their understanding of human movement, human mass movement in armies off of course, the Napoleonic Wars. Now, you come into World War II and you understand that you have a Germany that has been capped at the knee, so to speak, been disallowed to perform in regular statecraft because of World War One and settlements that were made, and understanding what their goal was. And of course, you try to get into the mind of someone like an Adolf Hitler, where to understand someone who's gone so far, and especially like we look now at the end game, we always know the end game, where it gets in 1945, guys killing himself after essentially running the murder camps and leading to the death of millions of Jews, let alone other peoples of the continent. You're trying to get into that person's head. It's very hard. You can't understand where they might have made the decisions to go down the paths that they had, but it is very important to, I would say, consider, right? And I think that's what Darryl was trying to do. And when he got blasted online and people kind of hopping on and trying to take advantage of the situation and use it as engagement, well, what they failed to realize is that most of the rebuttal, and I think the best rebuttal and the most good faith rebuttal that had come out, hadn't really gone against anything that he had said or any points that he had made, but had just shifted the blame from Churchill to the donor class, to the rest of the parliament, to the overall way of thinking of the British government. And I think that's kind of the point that he was making. So it's interesting to see how it's defended, right? To say that Churchill was an evil person, I'm not willing. I haven't done enough research on Churchill himself. I've done plenty on Nazi Germany and the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shire. Not sure if I got that right, but it was one of the best reads that I've ever done in my life. And understanding the innards and the processes that the Nazis and Nazi Germany used, it's fascinating. It is fascinating, and even if it is as evil as it can be, which if you're going to single out one group of people for murder and enslavement, for that matter, you have to be sick in the head, right? That's kind of just to be understood, and I think that's kind of a point that was to be made. Now, do we look at a Churchill as a hero? Do we look at Joseph Stalin as a hero, right? Things that come from World War II that many people would lead you to believe, right? If you get to any comment section nowadays, a lot of times what you'll see is that people like to back up the American might. They don't necessarily stand up behind President Roosevelt at the time, but they will back up the American cause and say that the Americans won the war. Okay, I grant you that. What you'll also see is the combative view, which Americans really didn't do that much. It was Stalin and the Russians that won the war. Look at how many people we lost and how many people have died. Again, you can give them that point, and you can say that's true. And you're going through all these arguments, and very rarely, but you will see some people that say that the ingenuity and the intellect of a guy like Churchill is what led the war. So you have maybe three competing factions saying what was the biggest factor in winning World War II, winning. And I think that it is important to look out from a broader lens and kind of understand at least what I think that Darryl Cooper, Martyr is trying to say. Listen, the whole conflict was a loss. There was no win, especially not after 1940, when there was an opportunity to settle, according to him and according to letters that he points out, coming from Nazi Germany, trying to settle a peace and no longer fight different factions against different factions, talking about Germany sending stuff to Great Britain. The United States, of course, not in the war at this point. Of course, supplying all sides. That's not to say that we were involved. Now, that point is made in order to say that there were efforts to stymie the peace talks, to make sure that the peace talks never went forward. And I do think it is important to point out those very moments, because you get to this point in history where we're at now where it is so automatically assumed that Hitler was the bad guy, the United States was the good guy, and Russia was indifferent, even, I would say. Nowadays, that is kind of understood, and it's weirdly understood that Russia was indifferent, when in fact, if we're being honest, Russia may have been one of the biggest promulgators of evil during that time. You look at the amount of deaths that can be accounted, some accounts of Joseph Stalin, right? You're talking about tens of millions of people, far more than Nazi Germany was ever responsible for. And I think this is where actually Darryl could have had a better argument. If you're being honest, instead of saying Churchill, just say Stalin. Just say Stalin, because you have so many different examples of evil regimes that popped up during the early 19th century, 20th century. I apologize, during the early 1900s, and understanding that you don't necessarily need to compare them on the bar graph, say this is the most evil because of X, and this is the no, and I think this is also a point he was trying to make, in that the world, especially when you get to that high up level of people, that type of leadership, you are talking about people who had to cut some throats to get where they had to go. And in understanding and in climbing that ladder, when you conduct foreign policy, you're going to cut some throats. And yeah, so if you look out and you're trying to compare evil, I think a great point would be, and is it right to point out that, well, there may have been an evil tinge to a Winston Churchill, to a Delano Roosevelt, to Joseph Stalin. You can still talk about evil just as much, or more so, just under a different light. And I think it's important to look at that. And again, because of the origin story that has come from World War II, which is to say that most people, when they think of World War II, they automatically think of the Jews and the Nazis. They think of the Jews that got killed by Adolf Hitler and how it led basically to their own nation state in an area that really had nothing to do with where they were mostly located at the time. The heaviest population pre-World War II of Jews was actually pretty concentrated into Eastern Europe. Okay, you're talking about big portions of them in the Russian Empire, as well as in Germany, of course, Ukraine. And as they start to see that I would say the tone of leadership in different nations, and as you start to see what their reactions are, you start to see the things pop up called pogroms that we talked about the last time when I talked about the Jews en masse. And they start to make, I would say, educated guesses on where the best place for them to go is. Some of them decide to go to the United States. Some of them went more to Western European countries, something like the United Kingdom. And some of them, especially after World War I, were pushing heavily to get their own land settled in the holy city of Jerusalem. And when you look forward, when you look past World War II and all the enemies and heroes that we make out of that, of course, Adolf Hitler being the number one enemy of the people and far beyond Stalin, which to me is unthinkable to not put them on the same level of evil if you're going to talk evil. And what it became when you're talking about the interesting case, in my opinion, of Israel, the creation of a nation state out of whole cloth that was done almost entirely with the diplomatic will of Britain and with I would say, the prowess of American military, as well as the financial backing of a lot of Americans and people around the world, really. And what it's become today, because it's so interesting to me, because it's so obvious. They don't ever really draw this line for you in school, at least I don't think, but maybe if you take a Holocaust and Genocide Studies class, maybe they do. But there's a clear link between World War II and the Jews need a home for themselves. It's pretty obvious, and the home from themselves stems right from it. Israel is settled, officially becomes a country in 1948. They're at war right away, all their neighbors. Okay. Now, if you're paying attention and you're going to not just take the Western media's word to your chest immediately, and you're going to try to do a little bit of research, what you're going to find is that the creation of Israel as a nation, the creation of Israel as a people, came with many of the downfalls that we attribute to Islamic societies nowadays. And understanding that the use of terroristic opportunities and mass harm and propaganda in order to achieve one's political end is one of the main ways that Israel comes to be and exerts the power that it does, is through mass manipulation, propaganda, through utilizing its heavier pocketed allies and using them as a wedge to get what they want essentially in the Middle East. And when you go at it from that perspective, and when you're not just taking it again for what you'll hear in the West a lot, especially in the United States, which is where I live, of course, what you're going to hear, it doesn't matter if it's a left, right leaning news station, they all say the same thing, and it's that we're protecting the one democracy in the Middle East. We're protecting the one place where you can have a democratic say in the Middle East. It's always what you're going to hear. And it's sad to think that it's just not true, right? And telling the honest truth of how sour the regime can be, what needs to be done every single year, year in, year out, day in, day out, what has to be done by the Israeli leadership and government in order to maintain status quo there. If you get into the nitty gritty, you would say, why do we even try to make this experiment work anymore? It's clearly not set up for success. You're either going to piss off one side or piss off the other side of the Muslim world. And I'm not trying to put any blame on the Muslim world. If anything, I'm putting more blame on Israel. Understanding that things are not as clean and pretty as this is our only democracy in the Middle East. When you make a realization, maybe you don't, that this is a foreign people coming into a land that they don't own in the 1900s. We're not talking about 16, 17, 1500s. We're talking about the 1900s, right after World War II. I'm talking about a place where there is established people everywhere. People are going to lose homes. People are going to lose family land that's been in the family for years. Holy Land is going to transfer hands with the institution of Israel. And you may start to understand, I would say, especially with that last case with Israel and Palestine and the conflicts that's been going on for generations at this point. You might start to understand that some of the lies that we're being told, I think, are pervasive. And you look back again, when you try to connect those dots and see how a narrative might be created for a worldview, you start to understand how an American First Patriot worldview comes to be, right? So you eliminate slavery out of the mind, or you make a justification for it. You take a justification, or again, make up some sort of excuse that sounds pretty, which I don't know how you do nowadays, but for the manifest destiny and westward expansion as the United States, and taking over land that we did, you could start to see how you can formulate an opinion that, well, the United States is always right? So when you go through from our revolution, follow a revolution, you're gonna make every excuse under the book for the founding fathers, saying that this is the era that they lived in. Yes, they stood up for hypocritical things, but they were just born under slavery, and you make all these excuses. And then it comes to the Civil War, and finally had to hash out these excuses, and slaves were emancipated thanks to Abraham Lincoln. And again, you're taking a very bird's eye view, not getting down into the facts and the honest cases, which might be bringing up the fact that what Abraham Lincoln was doing was known to be unconstitutional, at least to him. He didn't care, going against states' rights. All of these different things that kind of get pushed out of your head, and you get to World War II. First World War I, of course, but World War II, I think, is more effective in teaching, and you're going to follow that American myth, that American story that says, oh, us America had to come in and save the day, and FDR was just waiting. He didn't want to get us into war until the last moment when we were attacked, and it was all defensive. And no, we weren't selling guns to both sides, and no, we weren't trying to help out everybody involved. And you just avoid getting deep into the weeds again with World War II. It's so simple for me to see how you create that logic that gets you to a point now today where you defend the country of Israel with no excuses. You don't allow someone to criticize Benjamin Netanyahu. You don't allow people to criticize response to 9/11 attacks by the United States. You just don't allow these things because it goes against your narrative that you built for your country. And this is where I think we've reached as a country, and this is why I think it is so important to allow people like this, people that are going to say the countering narrative, out and not get crucified for it. Should you get criticized? 110%. Everybody deserves criticism, including myself. I fucking hope. I hope that you people lay it on me and all the shit that I got wrong, because it helps me learn. It tells me what to read. What do I lack in judgment? But it's hard. and it is very hard as a young American, I will say, to come through the schooling system and have to, if you care about history, if you don't care and you just want to be right all the time, or you want to be, it's very hard to be someone like a socialist communist without forgetting some of the things that you see in everyday life. It's just a fact. Like when you see someone trading and receiving the benefits of a trade, and a good example would be someone bringing up their cash to a cash register at a Walmart and they get the groceries that they need. Walmart is happy because they got paid. That person's happy because they got the lowest price possible for the food that they wanted to eat. And you see a problem with that. Well, then your problem might not really be with the foundation or the system that is capitalism, which we're obviously not a fully capitalist nation by this point, or just straight up economics or people functionality, people psychology. So it's very hard to be someone that kind of goes in the other spectrum, very anti-American, I guess you could say, in a way, or fascist, someone who just doesn't believe in freedom of speech or freedom of movement, freedom of economics, free trade. It's very easy to combat those people, but it's also, in my opinion, very easy to combat an American first, patriot, so to speak, which is funny as we speak as the podcast of We the Patriots, which I love to espouse. But I'll be honest, when we started this podcast, my knowledge of world and American events and history was just not at the level that it is today. And I would hope that's the case for all of you. When you start something, or when you're even looking at a timeline of your life, that you've learned along the way the different steps that you've taken. But, it is profound to me to think, at least, that I started this podcast, me and Andrew started this podcast under the guise that we were trying to forward American values. And the more and more and more that I learn, that I read, that I hear other podcasters talking about, the more I feel like I become just an individual, very pro America, but I would also say very understanding and accepting of the fact that America has its own foibles, its own problems in the world, and many problems of which that we created ourselves. And I would say if we are unable to make those criticisms, if we're unable to have someone like a Darryl Cooper pointing out the evil doings, or the, if you don't want to use that word, but the failures of an administration like a Churchill, and if you're unable to stomach the fact that both sides did something wrong in World War II, maybe I think a point to be broader taken would be, if you think World War II had just one cause, I don't think we would have gotten to a world war, right? If you can't take that have that capacity, if you can't take the time to try to see through what someone is saying, or hear the entirety of where they're coming from, well, then I'm sorry, but you shouldn't really be criticizing whatsoever, and you shouldn't really have a point to speak on. You shouldn't have anywhere to have a platform, because I think it could not be more important, especially nowadays, to be able to really open-mindedly confront the history that is the United States, that is Germany, that is England, that is the world, I would say. And taking those points of view and really honestly trying to learn and maybe understand how we can be better in the future. Because if we don't, if we keep telling our kids these whitewashed, fake histories, these fake stories, my only guess, because this is a guess, my only guess is that we're heading for worse version of what we see today, where you see major levels of anxiety, you see major levels of depression. And I think, again, not being a doctor, not trying to make any assumptions here, but I think you see, especially in the United States, these rates going up. Number one, because we test a heck of a lot more, which is a huge point. But number two, I think this really hurts young adults, is teaching kids lies that they have to teach themselves out of. Right? Teaching kids, I kind of make that argument of the Santa Claus argument. How long are you going to keep up that lie of Santa Claus? Because if you keep up that lie and your kid just keeps believing you, and your kid's like 14, 15, 16 years old and they still believe in Santa Claus, at some point you're going to have to break that news. And the longer you wait for that news to drop, the more you're going to destruct their worldview. Well, that's just my thoughts on today, how important it is. And of course, it's important for a country, especially the size of the United States, to create an origin story. But I think we got to take a step back and look and maybe understand and portray ourselves maybe more as human beings. Given as though all human beings are flawed, all human beings have their issues, and we should all totally understand that, I think it's pretty reasonable to say that maybe we should consider the flaws of nations as well, and not just the nations that we're going up against, or not just adversarial nations, but our own nations as well. I've been Sal Asante. This is We the Patriots podcast. Could not thank you enough. And we'll catch you guys next week. Have a good one.
I wanna be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.